Hello, everyone. This is Joseph Holbrook, your professor for REL 3106, Religion in Latin America. And once again, I'm off center. How do I fix this? Let's try it that way. There, that's a little better. Uh, REL 3106, Religion in Latin America. And today we're talking about Chapter 9, uh, after Catholicism after Vatican II, which was a watershed mark in the development and changes of Catholicism in the 20th century. So we will dive right into it. Let's go to my notes. So, great changes came to the Catholic Church in the middle of the 20th century with the convening of the Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, by Pope John the 23rd. Pope John the 23rd is a very interesting pope. I've read a couple biographies about him. He was unusual. He was, you could even say, heroic during World War II in his role in helping refugees. He was not anti-communist in the way the previous popes had been. Even though he was not communist, of course, he was a man who believed in loving your enemies, and he reached out to the Soviet Union and tried to establish friendly ties with Stalin and Stalin's family, as well as with John Kennedy, who was had recently been elected the first Catholic president of the United States. There's a whole story about how he contributed to defusing the Cuban Missile Crisis because of the ties he had created with Stalin and his family. And John Kennedy reached out to him to ask for help in defusing the world on the edge of a nuclear holocaust. Anyway, he became Pope in 1959 and immediately called for a Second Vatican Council. The First Vatican Council had been at the end of the 19th century and was notable for greatly enlarging and strengthening the power of the Pope, so that the Pope became uh, virtually a monarch, an absolute monarch of the Catholic Church, and it diminished the role of the College of Cardinals and Archbishops. And so the Second Vatican Council, the purpose of it was to aggiornamento, which is an Italian word means throwing open the windows, letting in some fresh air to engage the modern world. So he issued this call in 1959 after the Cuban Revolution, and they finally met in 1962. This was a revolutionary decade. It's almost hard to communicate all the radical things that were happening from the Cuban Revolution right on through the early and middle 70s. You had the Cuban Revolution, which created a fervor in Latin America. Then Vatican II, beginning in 1962, which created a fervor within Catholicism. Then you had the organization of CELAM, which was the Council of Latin American Bishops, which was formed in 1966. And they had their second meeting in Medellin in 1968, where they discussed liberation, some of the central ideas of liberation theology. And that was a watershed mark for the Catholic Church towards a preferential option for the poor, in which the church, which had traditionally been on the side of the wealthy elites, began to pivot towards taking the side of the poor and the marginalized. In this same decade, you had the sudden explosion of SEBs, particularly after 1968. SEBs were small communities at the popular level within Catholicism. It literally means Comunidades Eclesiales de Base. I said that in Portuguese, de base. These are grassroots Christian-based communities, and they popped up and spread all over Brazil, all over Nicaragua, Central America. They were in Mexico, Colombia, during this, especially during the 1970s. interestingly enough, this is at the same time as in the United States you have the hippie commune movement, and you also have the rise of house churches and cell-based churches within Christian growth, church growth thinking. Liberation theology, the most people agree that it started around 1971. It had its roots, of course, in Vatican II and the Bishops' Council in Medellin. It also had its roots in the Young Catholic Workers and Young Catholic Students organizations that I studied for my dissertation. And I have the wrong date there. The Nicaraguan Revolution happened in 1979 and was supported by a number of Catholic priests as well as Protestant pastors who had been influenced by liberation theology. So there was this period of time from 1959 through the 1979 was full of a sort of a revolutionary buzz or fervor. There were also a lot of people assassinated during that time. We're not talking about the United States today, but just in the United States alone, you had President John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, Malcolm X were all assassinated during this time period. In Latin America, you had the assassination, or not assassination, I'm sorry, the Camilo Torres, who was a guerrilla priest, died in battle in Colombia, and Che Guevara died in trying to start a revolution in Bolivia during this same period of time. So it was a violent upheaval and a time of real ferment. So I've already talked about the Consejo Episcopal Latinoamericano, Salem, which was organized in 1966. It had its second session in Colombia in 1969. It opened the way for the development of SEBs, small communities of faith, known as base ecclesial communities. Both SEBs and liberation theology made a significant impact throughout the world in the context of the Cold War. There was a sense that you were either for one side or the other during the Cold War and after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there was a sharp rise of political polarization and violence in most countries in Latin America. I don't know, this is the fall of 2020, the great pandemic of 2020, and I guess you could say there's been a rise in the United States of political polarization and even the potential for violence. So maybe we're repeating some Latin American history here. This radicalization on behalf of the poor inevitably led to resistance and opposition, not only to SEBS, but also to liberation theology, within the church and without it. Vatican II, I already talked about this, so I'm going to skip over it. Pope John the 23rd felt the time had come to engage the modern world. So the council finally gathered in 1962. They brought together a number of position papers that had been developed by both the Vatican staff as well as a number of cardinals and bishops. There were a number of theologians that were there in attendance called the Peretti. They were there to assist the cardinal and the archbishops that they were with from their regular countries. One of them included Gustavo Gutierrez, who was there from Peru as a Peretti and a theological advisor. There were also invited non-Catholic observers, Protestant, as well as Eastern Orthodox. Actually, Latin America was slightly underrepresented with only 22% of the conciliar fathers represented, even though Latin America had 38% of all Catholics in the world living in Latin America. There was an emphasis in the council on preaching the centrality of Christ. And the most visible change was a move away from Latin to the vernacular, meaning in the United States, Mass would be conducted in English instead of Latin. In Colombia, it would be conducted in Spanish instead of Latin. This is an attempt to make the Mass more relevant to the popular classes. The more conservative wings of the church resisted these changes, especially a secretive organization called Opus Dei, which had its origins in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. There was a discussion of poverty and its causes. Of course, this came just a year after the publication of a classic anthropological work done by a anthropologist by the name of Oscar Lewis, who spent a number of years in Mexico uh, observing and interacting with and interviewing a family called Sanchez. And what he was studying was their patterns of poverty and violence and dysfunction. So The Children of Sanchez, the autobiography of a Mexican family, was published in 1961. This became the source of an idea of a culture of poverty, and that poverty is passed down through generations. Uh, and this came from Oscar Lewis's book. I highly recommend it if you have a chance to read it, as a classic work on Latin American anthropology. A movie was also made out of it, The Children of Sanchez, with what's his name? I can't remember the actor's name. If I said it, you would know who it was. Let me see if I can Google it really quick. Children of Sanchez movie, and in the C we get there it is. And who is the actor? Anthony Quinn. Anthony Quinn plays Sanchez, and the movie is based on this book about his family and a lot of their dysfunctional patterns and their tendency to fall back into poverty every generation. And this went along with a lot of development thinking at the time. Uh, if you remember, John Kennedy, after the Cuban Revolution and the failure of Bay of Pigs, came up with an idea called it's not the Good Neighbor policy. It was I can't remember right now, but he came up with an idea to invest money in Latin America, kind of like the United States did at the end of World War II with the Marshall Plan. Alliance for Progress. That's what it was called. It was the Alliance for Progress, and this is based on a developmentalism idea that if you just invest money in the right things and you build infrastructure and develop the economy, that the culture will progress into modernity. But this began to be questioned later on by dependency theory, which I'll come back to. In 1965, 60 radical priests in Argentina started an organization called Sacerdotes para el Tercer Mundo, priests for the third world, and it spread throughout the continent. In 1968, there was another meeting of radicalized priests in Colombia at a farm called Golconda. There were 50 priests, and they adopted an even more radical stance than the Sacerdotes para el Tercer Mundo. They came out with an affirmation that Christians should support armed revolution, armed insurrection, to overthrow unjust structures. The leader of the Golconda group was Camilo Torres, a priest and a sociologist who despaired of being able to bring change and justice for the poor through incremental means. So he left and went into the jungle, joined a guerrilla movement, and was killed in one of the first battles. Kind of hauntingly like Jose Marti, I suppose. There were also Latin American Protestants who were embracing the theology of revolution proposed in Geneva in 1966 under the auspices of the World Council of Churches. Another giant of liberation theology was the Bishop of Recife, Brazil, Dom Helder Câmara. In 1967, he was the leader of the Brazilian Council of Bishops, and they authored a declaration of bishops of the Third World dealing with issues of poverty and illiteracy in Brazil. In Medellin, in 1968, CELAM, which was the Council of Latin American Bishops, organized a meeting in order to their second meeting in order to consider issues that affected all of them in Latin America. So that Pope Paul VI actually visited in that same year, and he sent a mixed message when he arrived in Bogota in a military helicopter. But he basically tended towards the liberal side that his predecessor, John the 23rd, had also represented. And in the documents that were issued out of Medellin, they were very critical of the ills of society. The first document criticized the evils of both capitalism and communism. This sometimes is called third wayism, the idea that both communism and capitalism are evil and oppress people, and that people of good faith need to find a third path. And of course, this is during the height of the Cold War. And one of the quotes from the document, both systems militate against the dignity of the human person. We must denounce the fact that Latin America sees itself caught between these two options and remains dependent on one or the other of the centers of power which control its economy. It also called for a new political order in which power would not be concentrated in the hands of a few. I think that's something that's even very current in the United States with you when you have populist movements on the right and the left, and there's a very deep awareness of the wealthy elites, the big tech, and the banks. And so this is a problem that's been around for a while, and it seems now that we're facing it more in North America than in ways that the South America has faced it in the past. There was another document dealing with justice, encouraging the establishment of small basic communities, SEBs, to counterbalance the elite, the power that the elite holds. The second document declared that injustice was institutionalized violence. So poverty, for example, is institutionalized violence. And of course, this opens up the possibility of saying that violent insurrection against these unjust structures is simply resistance. It's a defensive violence against institutionalized violence. The bishops at Medellin did not commit to revolution itself, but they opened the door for a more radical understanding of the mission of the church and society in promoting social and economic change. I mentioned earlier that the SEBs, the base ecclesial communities, exploded into view in the late 60s and the 1970s, especially in Brazil. They met in homes, schools, and other facilities, and they often had very strong lay leadership. The Brazilian president, Jânio Quadros, was a populist who was elected in 1961, encouraged the development of SEBs in Brazil, also to promote literacy and education. This brings up Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator who rejected what he called traditional banking view of education, where you're just dumping information into people's minds. But he proposed a different approach, which he called the pedagogy of the oppressed, in which the teacher engages with the adult students because they were trying to bring literacy to poor rural workers, farmers, and you allowed them to learn how to read and write through issues that were of current interest to them, and that it was a more indirect, less hierarchical form of pedagogy, of teaching. He wrote The Pedagogy of Oppressed, which appeared around the same time as Cardozo and Faleto's book on dependency theory and Gustavo Gutierrez's book, Theology of Liberation. So in the area of education, you have an idea of liberation through education. Then also in the area of economics, you have an idea of dependency theory, the idea that Latin America was locked into dependence as the first world exploited them for their raw materials and then sold back to them value-added technology. So these ideas all appeared between 1970 and 1972 in the shadow of the Cuban Revolution. So you can see why in the area of religion, in the area of economics, in the area of education, and in the area of politics, for sure, there was a revolutionary fervor or effervescence, unrest. And around this time, Jânio Quadros resigned rather abruptly and very weirdly, and his vice president, João Goulart, came to power as the president. And João Goulart was also a populist, even more so, and more left-leaning. and he began to move Brazil leftward. He visited China and sought to foment ties with communist China. This was before China had been brought into the world community by Nixon, or around this. Yeah, it was before. And so, as Joan Goulart was president, he brought in the Young Catholic Students movement and Young Catholic workers, and these young Catholics actually gained a seat at the table of Goulart's cabinet in his administration, and were advising the president on social policies and social justice issues. This was a high point for the Young Catholic Students movement, which I studied for my dissertation over a 40-year period. And so it seemed in 1963 and early 1964 there was all this populist uproar and fervency, and Brazil seemed to be reaching a revolutionary boiling point. But the Brazilian military, with encouragement from conservative Catholics, traditional Catholics, middle class, professional classes, decided to intervene and to forestall the possibility of a Brazilian Marxist revolution in the style of Cuba. So in 1964, in April, I think it was April 4th, 1964, the Brazilian military overthrew the Brazilian government and took power for a period of almost 20 years. The Brazilian bishops also issued a pastoral plan at the end of Vatican II called the Plano Pastoral de Conjunto, or a plan for a joint pastoral practice, calling for the establishment of these small communities in SEBs. And also, a lot of these small communities were very involved in literacy programs with the pedagogy of the oppressed. So there was a lot going on in Brazil. There was a growing sense among the Latin American Catholics that the church actually belongs to the people, that the church is the people and not the hierarchy. The church as the people of God. A third three-step method emerged during this time for reflection and analysis, and this was part of my dissertation studies. This came out of the Young Catholic Workers movement, which I studied over a 40-year period. They developed an analysis, three-step analysis process, which is ver, juzgar, and actuar. First, you have to see what's going on, you have to discern what's going on, and then you have to act redemptively, and then you do it again. Then you go back to observing, discernment, and then acting again. And this actually became very influential in liberation theology. And so in the SEBs, lay leaders were trained in this three-step process of discernment, and they would meet for prayer and Bible study, and then they would take what they're reading in the Bible and apply it to their actual daily lives, their economic lives, and they would discern what they needed to do. Then they would act, sometimes forming cooperatives, sometimes forming common child care facilities, other times agitating for better conditions, better infrastructure. Trained lay leaders in the SEBs and among the people were called delegates of the word. One of the priests who was participated in the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua was Ernesto Cardinal, who was a priest in a town called Solentiname in the island of Lake Managua, and he wrote a book about the stories that the people told in these discernment sessions as they studied the Gospels, called the Gospel in Solentiname. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. And from there we see the emergence of liberation theology. There were three particular leaders, innovators, fathers of liberation theology in Latin America. The one that's the most well known and is considered to be the father of liberation theology was a Dominican priest named Gustavo Gutierrez in Lima, Peru. He's still there. He's still alive. I've read several of his books. Then there was a Jesuit, Juan Luis II, and a Franciscan from Brazil, Leonardo Boff, who no longer is a Catholic priest. He finally left the church after he had been silenced several times by Pope Paul II. Gutierrez is considered to be the founding father of Latin American theology. In 1971, he published the first major work on the subject, A Theology of Liberation, which I highly recommend. He was a mestizo born in a poor family in Peru. He joined the Dominicans and received his doctorate in Europe. When Salem met in Medellin, he was one of the Peretti. In 1992, he wrote Las Casas, referring to Bartolomé de las Casas, In Search of the Poor of Jesus Christ. Gutierrez insists that the theology is always a process of reflection and practice. He made very clear the distinction. Let me pause for a moment. Nope. Juan Segundo was a Uruguayan priest. He wrote an open theology for the adult layperson. He also wrote The Liberation of Theology, and he was deeply influenced by one of my favorite theologians, French theologian Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Leonardo Boff was a Brazilian and a former Franciscan who studied systematic theology in Germany under Karl Rahner. Karl Rahner was one of the outstanding Catholic theologians of the 20th century. And I'm going to skip over some of this, talking about the detail of what they wrote. In addition, there was out of liberation theology, as it kind of fragmented in later years, a lot of other liberation theologies came out of it, such as Black liberation theology with James Cone, and there was feminist liberation theology with the Mexican Maria Pilar Aquino and Brazilian Ana Maria Tepedino. A couple other theologians of liberation were Hugo Osman of Brazil, who was one of the first to propose Marxism as an instrument of social analysis. And of course, I've already mentioned Dom Helder Camara, who rejected Marxism and emphasized the centrality of the church. There was political polarization and violence. The Cuban Revolution increased the links with the Soviet Union and the polarization in Latin America. Castro tried to export revolution. I've already mentioned that Che Guevara was killed in Bolivia. Then there's a situation in Chile where Salvador Allende, a socialist, was elected in 1970 and planned to nationalize private banks, but was overthrown by Augusto Pinochet and committed suicide. In Nicaragua and Peru and Colombia, leftist guerrilla groups arose to oppose dictatorial governments. In 1978, the Sandinista guerrillas took the National Palace, and then in 1979 they overthrew Anastasio Somoza. And of course, this set off a reaction. And already in 1964 in Brazil, there was a military dictatorship. And then again, 1973 in Chile, 1976 in Argentina, there was a military dictatorship and a horrendous number of people who were disappeared or tortured or killed. And this also came over into the area of theology in the Catholic Church with the election of John Paul II, who was known heroically for his opposition in Poland to Marxism, but in Latin America he came off more conservative because of his opposition to liberation theology. One of the final sections of this chapter talks about the piety of the people, in other words, popular religion. Vatican II emphasized the centrality of Christ. For many, this seemed to mean that the saints had to be pushed aside. A little bit of shades of the Protestant Reformation. And many buildings in Latin America, images of the saints were moved to less conspicuous places. Rome expunged from the list of saints many that never existed, like St. Christopher, who actually there's no proof that he was a living person, although I've heard things to the contrary as well about St. Nicholas. The clergy tried to make the laity understand that St. Lazarus, for example, was not the poor man who was in Abraham's bosom with the rich man covered with sores, but actually St. Lazarus was the brother of Mary and Martha. However, this idea of St. Lazarus covered in rags and sores, surrounded by dogs licking his sores, was such a powerful icon for popular religion that it was impossible to eradicate that. He was also identified in Santeria and I think Umbanda in Brazil as a powerful African deity named Babalue. Many poor Catholics felt that the saints were easier to approach than Jesus. They still sought out the images of the saints even when they were removed to remote places. The attempt to discourage popular religiosity was eventually abandoned, and church leaders recognized that popular religion was practiced precisely because it was beyond the control of established church authorities. In conclusion, Salem, the Latin American Bishops' Conference, met again in the Dominican Republic in 1992, their third meeting. It was the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Western Hemisphere, which is a little problematic on its own right, but for the Catholic Church, it was the beginning of Catholicism in Latin America. Salem also acknowledged much of the work had been done in complicity with violence, oppression, and injustice. How can you think about the arrival of the Spaniards 500 years ago and not admit that? Thus, what Salem now proposed was a new evangelization that would be carried out by all true believers, lay people as well as ordained, and which must include issues of justice and liberation. The tenor of the conference in Santo Domingo showed that the polarization of the earlier decades was slowly being resolved, and many of the tenets of liberation theology now became part of the official position of Salem. Another thing that they were concerned about was the growing Pentecostal threat. By 1992, they realized that Pentecostalism, unlike earlier mainline Protestantism, was exploding throughout Latin America, and in fact continued to explode beyond 1992 into the early 21st century. And so as the 20th century came to the close, Pentecostalism was growing at a rate that Catholic leaders found alarming. Many of them were struggling with Pentecostalism for the very soul. Many of them felt they were struggling for the soul of Latin America. And they feared that this vast region, which had been almost exclusively Catholic, where 50 years earlier 30% had been all the Catholics in the world had lived in Latin America, was going to become Pentecostal. So that ends chapter 9, and we will pick up with Pentecostalism next. Okay. Take care. Have a good week. Stay safe. Wear your mask and wash your hands. Talk to you all later. Bye.